Philip Ashford stood at the head of a boardroom table and promoted his mistress to vice president of the $100 billion company his wife secretly owned. And he did it with the particular confidence of a man who has never once considered that the floor beneath him belongs to someone else. 340 people applauded. Natalie Renner smiled from the front row, the kind of smile that already knew the outcome before the room did. Catherine Ashford, Philip's mother, would call the house that evening to leave a congratulatory message about her son's bold leadership. The word bold would sit on the voicemail like a stone. And 2 blocks away, in a third-floor waiting room that smelled of recycled air and quiet dread, Philip's wife sat alone in a plastic chair, holding a paper cup of water she hadn't touched, waiting for a set of scan results her husband didn't know she was receiving, because he had stopped coming to these appointments 8 months ago. What Philip did not know, what not one person in that applauding boardroom could have known, was that the company they were celebrating, Ashford Stern Pharmaceuticals, its $11 billion valuation, its flagship immunotherapy compound, its operating license, its founding equity, 54% of all of it, belonged to his wife. Not to the company, not to him, to her, personally, legally, irrevocably. And the licensing agreement that made any of it commercially possible was set to expire in 60 days. Her name was Dr. Miriam Solis, and she had built this compound before she ever knew his. This isn't just a story about a husband who forgot who his wife was. It's about what happens when a woman who was never actually powerless finally decides to stop pretending otherwise. If you believe that quiet people are the ones worth watching, leave a like and subscribe, because this channel is built for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now, to understand what Philip Ashford was really celebrating that morning, we need to go back to where Ashford Stern Pharmaceuticals actually began. To understand what Ashford Stern Pharmaceuticals really was and who it really belonged to, we need to go back to where Miriam Solis began. Not where the company began, where she did. The story does not start in a boardroom. It starts in a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, in Baltimore, in the autumn of 2001, where a 23-year-old doctoral candidate was working past midnight on a binding mechanism that most of her advisors thought was too speculative to pursue. The lab smelled of ethanol and recycled air. The fluorescent light above her bench flickered every 40 minutes with the reliability of a punctuation mark. She had eaten half a granola bar at 4 in the afternoon and had not noticed the hunger since. This was not unusual. When Miriam Solis was inside a problem, the rest of the world became background noise, a soft, irrelevant hum behind the thing that actually mattered. What she was building, in that flickering light, was the foundational mechanism of what would eventually become Verisol 7. She did not know that yet. She knew only that the molecular binding pattern she was documenting had properties that existing immunotherapy models had not accounted for, and that if she was right, and she was careful about claiming to be right, always, because her father had taught her that precision was a form of respect, then the implications were significant. She wrote everything down. She dated every page. She filed everything under her name. Dr. Miriam Solis. Not a name she had borrowed. Not a name she had married into. Hers. Her father had made certain of that distinction long before she understood why it mattered. Dr. Ernesto Solis had spent 30 years as a patent attorney in Chicago, working out of a narrow office on North Michigan Avenue that he had kept deliberately modest. No glass wall, no receptionist with a headset, just bookshelves and a desk, and the kind of focused quiet that serious work requires. He had represented biochemists and engineers and materials scientists, brilliant people who had given their best ideas away on paper they hadn't read carefully enough. And he had spent those 30 years watching it happen, with the specific sorrow of a man who knew exactly which sentence in which clause had done the damage. He was not a bitter man. He was a precise one. There is a difference. When Miriam was 12, he had sat with her at the kitchen table, the same house she would keep after his death, and explained to her the difference between assignment and license. She had not fully understood it then. She had understood that it mattered to him, and that whatever mattered to her father with that particular quality of quiet attention was worth holding on to. She had held on to it. The kitchen table conversation that changed everything came later, the evening she brought Philip Ashford home for the first time. Philip was 31 then, lean with ambition, the kind of man who filled a room with forward momentum, ideas arriving faster than sentences, a handshake that communicated certainty before the words did. Miriam had loved that about him. The way he moved through the world as though the next thing was already almost here. She had been finishing her postdoctoral fellowship. He had been 2 years into a small biotech venture that had not yet found its compound. Ernesto had watched Philip across the dinner table with the patient attention of a man reviewing a contract. He had not been unkind. He had asked good questions and listened to the answers with his full face. But later, after Philip had gone and Miriam was washing the dishes, her father had come to stand in the kitchen doorway with his blue Northwestern law cup, the one with the seal already beginning to fade. And he had said, quietly, in the way he said things he needed her to remember, "Your name on your work is worth more than any name you borrow, mija. Never dissolve one into the other." She had turned from the sink. He had already gone back to his study. She had not forgotten it. 2 years later, when Philip's venture needed a compound, and Miriam's research provided the most viable candidate either of them had encountered, and when Philip had come to her father's kitchen table a second time, this time with a business plan and a question, Ernesto had been the one to structure the arrangement. The Solis Family Medical Trust, established in Delaware in March of 2011, provided the founding $22 million that capitalized Ashford Stern Pharmaceuticals. In exchange, the trust received a 54% equity stake. Philip received 31%. The balance went to 3 early investors whose names appeared in the original filing and nowhere else. The patent on Verisol 7's foundational mechanism was filed separately, personally, under Dr. Miriam Solis, not assigned to the company, but licensed to it under a renewable agreement that required her signature every 7 years. Philip had called it Miriam's paperwork quirk. He had signed everything his attorney put in front of him. His attorney, a general practice lawyer named Robert Healy, who had since retired to Scottsdale, had not read the trust instrument carefully enough to understand what 54% controlling equity actually meant in the context of the shareholder agreement's executive appointment clause, section 9, Arsim 100, page 14, half a paragraph that no one had thought to revisit in 12 years. Ernesto had written that clause himself. He died 18 months after the company's founding, in the upstairs bedroom of the house on Farwell Avenue, with Miriam holding his hand, and the accordion folder of original documents already organized on his desk downstairs, color-coded, labeled in his careful handwriting, waiting for a morning he had known he would not see. He had prepared her for everything. He had trusted her with all of it. He had not told Philip any of it, because Philip had not asked, and because her father had understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 30 years reading what people signed without reading, that the most durable protection is the kind no one thinks to look for. Those first years, the company was small enough that the truth of its foundation barely mattered in practice. Philip ran operations with genuine skill. He was good at it, at the investor calls and the regulatory navigation and the particular kind of confident storytelling that early-stage pharmaceutical companies need to survive. Miriam ran the science. She was in the lab 6 days a week, managing the research team, refining the Verisol 7 trials, catching the problems in the data that took everyone else an extra week to find. At conferences, Philip introduced her as the scientific mind behind everything we do, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. That particular warmth was real, and she had loved him for it, and she had believed, the way people believe things they need to believe, that it would stay. It did not stay. The change was not sudden. It arrived the way erosion arrives, imperceptibly, and then all at once when you look at what remains. The first Forbes profile appeared when the company's valuation crossed $2 billion. Philip was on the cover. The article mentioned Miriam once, in the 4th paragraph, as his wife. Not Dr. Solis, not the biochemist whose doctoral research had produced the compound. His wife. Philip had read the piece over breakfast and said nothing about the omission. He had refilled his coffee. He had moved on to his emails. Miriam had folded the magazine closed. She had not said anything either. That silence was the beginning. Not of a decision, she was not calculating yet, not even close, but of a noticing, the slow accumulation of moments in which her name was replaced by her relationship to him. Her work was replaced by the company's work. Her expertise was replaced by a polite and faintly apologetic smile when colleagues asked what she did. She kept working. She kept showing up. She kept loving him with the stubborn fidelity of a woman who had decided to love someone and was not prepared to revise that decision based on ordinary disappointment. She had not yet understood that what was happening was not ordinary disappointment. That understanding was still ahead of her. It was waiting in a boardroom she would be asked to leave. In a laboratory she would be told she no longer needed. In a voicemail from her mother-in-law about a woman named Natalie Renner, and something called bold leadership. It was waiting in a document on page 14, in a clause her father had written by hand, in a name that had never once been removed from any paper that mattered. Her name. Still there. Exactly where he had put it. The erasure did not begin with cruelty. It began with a Forbes profile, a missing name, and a man who did not notice the omission because he had already, somewhere beneath his conscious thinking, stopped expecting her name to be there. But that comes later. To understand what Philip Ashford lost when he stopped seeing Miriam clearly, you first have to understand what she was before he saw her at all. Ernesto Solis had built his career on a single observation repeated across 30 years of practice. Brilliant people are the most generous signers of documents they haven't read. He had watched chemists hand their formulas to investors for equity splits that would have made a first-year law student wince. He had watched engineers assign their patents outright, not license, assign, permanently, irrevocably, for the promise of a salary and a title that lasted 18 months before the acquisition closed and the title disappeared. He had represented these people in the aftermath, when there was very little left to represent, and he had carried each case home with him in the specific way that a man carries something he cannot put down. Not bitterness, precision. The understanding that the single most dangerous sentence in any agreement is the one no one reads aloud. He worked from an office on North Michigan Avenue that he had deliberately kept modest. 2 rooms, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that had belonged to his own father, and a window that looked at a brick wall and was therefore useful for nothing except thinking. He did not advertise. He did not attend galas. He built his reputation the way he built everything. Quietly, specifically, with complete attention to the document in front of him, and none whatsoever to the performance of being impressive. Miriam had grown up in the house on Farwell Avenue watching him work, understanding before she had words for it that the most serious men she would ever meet would be the quietest ones. She had her mother's warmth and her father's precision, and the combination made her the kind of scientist other scientists wanted in their corner. Not for her confidence, which was genuine but unshowy, but for her rigor. She did not claim to know things she had not proven. She did not round up. She did not perform certainty to fill a silence. In a field that rewarded loud conclusions, this made her slower to publish and more often correct. The doctoral work at Johns Hopkins had begun in 2001 as an exploration of T-cell signaling pathways that most of her advisors considered too narrow to yield anything commercially significant. They were wrong, as it turned out. Though it took years and several iterations, and one breakthrough at 2 a.m. that Miriam recorded in her lab notebook with a date, a time, and a single underlined sentence before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. The foundational mechanism she identified that year, the binding behavior at a specific protein receptor that would eventually become Verisol 7's therapeutic core, was documented in her name, filed under her name, dated and witnessed under her name. Dr. Miriam Solis. Her father had been very clear about that. She met Philip Ashford 4 years later at a conference in Chicago where she had presented a paper, and he had been in the audience for reasons she later understood had less to do with immunology than with the fact that he had been tracking the emerging therapeutic pipeline with the focused appetite of a man looking for his compound. He had found her afterward, asked 3 genuinely intelligent questions, and then asked if she wanted to get coffee. She had said yes because the questions were good. She brought him home 6 months later. Her father had watched Philip across the dinner table with the patient attention of a man reviewing a contract. He had asked good questions. He had listened well. He had shaken Philip's hand at the door with warmth and said sincerely that it had been a pleasure. Then he had come to the kitchen doorway while Miriam was washing the dishes, held his blue Northwestern law cup in both hands, and said it quietly, the way he said things he needed her to carry. "Your name on your work is worth more than any name you borrow, Mika. Never dissolve one into the other." She had turned from the sink. He was already gone. 2 years later, when Philip's biotech venture needed a compound and Miriam's research offered the most viable candidate either of them had seen, Ernesto had structured the arrangement himself. The Solis Family Medical Trust, filed in Delaware in March of 2011, provided the founding $22 million that capitalized Ashford Stern Pharmaceuticals. Philip had been told, accurately if incompletely, that he had secured investor backing. He had celebrated. He had not asked who. The trust received 54% controlling equity in exchange. Philip received 31%. The Verisol 7 patent remained personally held by Dr. Miriam Solis under a renewable license, not an assignment, never an assignment, and Philip had signed the licensing agreement along with everything else his attorney put in front of him, calling it, without malice and without understanding, Miriam's paperwork quirk. Robert Healy, Philip's attorney at the time, had since retired to Scottsdale. He had not flagged Section 9-100. In those first years, the oversight hardly seemed to matter, because the marriage was still warm, and Miriam was in the building, managing the science with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and Philip was genuinely, visibly proud of her. He introduced her at industry dinners as the scientific mind behind everything we do, and the people he said it to understood from his tone that he meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. She had believed him. She had believed him because it was true, and because she loved him, and because there was, in those years, no reason not to. The Forbes profile arrived when the company's valuation crossed $2 billion. It ran 6 pages. Philip was on the cover in a charcoal suit, the Chicago skyline behind him. The article mentioned Miriam once, in a subordinate clause in the 4th paragraph, as his wife. Not Dr. Solis. Not the biochemist whose doctoral research had produced the mechanism the company was built on. His wife. Philip read the piece over breakfast on a Tuesday morning and said nothing about the omission. He refilled his coffee. He moved to his emails. Miriam folded the magazine closed and set it on the kitchen counter, and did not say anything either. Not because she had nothing to say. Because she understood, with the precision her father had given her, that this was the first sentence of a document she was only beginning to read. The erasure accelerated so gradually that Miriam almost missed the pattern. Almost. It began with language, not dramatic language. Nothing shouted across a room, nothing that would leave a mark she could point to. It was the language of omission, which is quieter and considerably more damaging. Philip stopped using her title in introductions somewhere around the company's 4th year when the valuation crossed $3 billion and the interview requests began arriving weekly. She noticed it the first time it happened at a biopharma conference in 2017. A journalist had asked who she was, and Philip had said, smoothly and without pause, "My wife, Miriam," and moved the conversation forward before the journalist could ask a follow-up. Miriam had stood beside him with a glass of water she didn't want, and said nothing. She had told herself it was a small thing. It was a small thing. Small things have a way of accumulating. By the 5th year, the formulation had evolved. She became "my wife, who's been a tremendous support through all of this," a sentence that positioned her as audience rather than author. By the 6th year, when a profile in the Chicago Business Journal described Ashford Stern as Philip Ashford's vision, built from the ground up, she had read the line twice and then set the magazine on the kitchen counter in the same spot where the Forbes issue had landed 2 years before, and had understood that she was watching a narrative being written. Not maliciously, perhaps, but consistently, in which she did not exist. The irony is not lost. The man rewriting her out of the company's story had built that company on her science, with her money in her name. He simply did not know it. Catherine Ashford had entered the marriage's architecture the way cold enters a house, gradually through the small gaps. She was a woman of immaculate presentation. Never a hair unrequired, never a sentence unconsidered, never a cruelty that couldn't be mistaken for concern. She had been a hospital administrator for 22 years, which had given her an expert's facility for delivering difficult information in a register that sounded like kindness. She deployed this skill at every family gathering with the precision of a woman who had practiced it until it became instinct. "Are you sure you're well enough to be here, Miriam? You look a little peaked." This at Christmas 2018, when Miriam was in perfect health. "I just worry, that's all. You've been carrying so much." This at Easter, when what Miriam had been carrying was a full research load that Catherine did not know existed. The word peaked, deployed at intervals, became a kind of verbal footnote to Miriam's presence at every Ashford family event. A subtle reminder, renewed seasonally, that her status in the room was provisional. Miriam had smiled at every iteration. She had thanked Catherine for her concern. She had never once told her she was a biochemist who held a controlling equity stake in the company Catherine's son was currently running. She had understood, from a young age, that some rooms are not worth correcting. Then something shifted. Natalie Renner joined Ashford Stern's research division in the spring of 2020 as Director of Clinical Development, recruited from a competing firm in Boston with a reputation for aggressive pipeline management. Philip mentioned her name at dinner 3 times in the first 2 weeks. This was not in itself unusual. He often talked about new hires with the particular enthusiasm of a man who measured organizational progress through personnel. But the third mention had a different texture, a slight softening around the syllables. The way he said, Natalie's take on the Phase 2 timeline, with the casual familiarity of someone who had already had the conversation several times before bringing it home. Miriam noticed it the way she noticed everything. Quietly, completely, without reaction. She was deep in her 2nd year of treatment by then, the lymphoma responding slowly but steadily to the protocol her oncologist, Dr. Priya Nair, had designed. The treatment had changed her body in ways she was still learning, her full hips carrying new weight from the medication, her arms she'd learned to cover beneath the long-sleeved layers she preferred now, a fatigue that lived in her bones and surfaced without warning. She had wondered, in her more private moments, whether the illness had distorted her instincts, whether what she was noticing in Philip was real or reconstructed by exhaustion and prednisone. She had given him the benefit of the doubt with the deliberate generosity of a woman who was trying to be fair. She had given him that doubt for 8 months. The board pre-meeting convened on a Wednesday morning in November. 5 people around the small conference table on the 23rd floor of the Ashford Stern building on West Wacker Drive. Miriam had asked to attend specifically to raise a concern about the Verisol 7 Phase 3 trial design, a dosing model irregularity she had identified in the data she still reviewed from home, a problem in the binding interval calculations that no one currently in the lab had the foundational knowledge to catch. She had prepared notes. She had reviewed the relevant literature the night before, sitting up past midnight with her reading glasses and a cup of tea she'd made herself, alone, in the kitchen. She had presented the concern in 3 sentences: precise, sourced, specific. Philip had looked at her from across the table with an expression that was almost kind. That almost was important. It meant he knew somewhere that what he was about to say required a softer wrapper. "Miriam," he said, "you haven't been in the lab in 8 months. Let's let the team who's been working on this handle it." The other 4 people at the table did not look at her. This was its own information. She nodded. She gathered her notes. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that the team who'd been working on it was working on a mechanism that could not be commercially deployed without her signature on a document that would expire in less than a year. She did not say it because she had learned, from a man who had spent 30 years reading what people signed without reading, that the best time to correct a record is when the record is complete. She walked out of the conference room and into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her. Through the wall she heard Philip's voice resume, even, unhurried, explaining something to the room from which she had just been dismissed. She placed one hand flat against the wall. Down the hall, through his office door, she could hear the particular low frequency of Philip on the phone, his professional register, the one with the slight downward cadence at the end of each sentence that meant he was performing authority. She did not intend to listen. She was simply standing still when she heard it. "It's fine," he was saying. "The family health situation is being managed. It's not a factor." The family health situation. Her hand stayed flat against the wall. Her breathing steadied. She did not move for a long moment, and anyone watching from the end of the hallway would have seen only a compact woman in a practical blazer, standing very still, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, her face entirely composed. What they would not have seen was the decision forming beneath the composure, not yet fully formed, not yet actionable, but present, the way the first change of pressure is present before a weather system arrives, invisible to most instruments, unmistakable to the ones calibrated finely enough. She straightened. She walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. The words on paper would say the rest. The cruelty, when it graduated from words into systems, did not announce itself. It arrived the same way the earlier cruelties had, framed as consideration, wrapped in the language of care, delivered by a man who had perhaps convinced himself that what he was doing was reasonable. It was a Saturday morning in January when Philip came to the doorway of Miriam's home laboratory, the downstairs room on the north side of the house that caught the best winter light, the one she had converted in the company's 3rd year with bookshelves along 2 walls and a long central bench that held her reference materials and her personal research files. She was at the bench in her reading glasses and a cardigan that had been washed enough times to become something comfortable rather than presentable, reviewing binding interval data on the Verisol 7 Phase 3 model. The fatigue from treatment still lived in her bones on certain mornings, but her mind had remained precise throughout, untouched by the prednisone and the protocol in the way that the most fundamental things sometimes survive everything else. Philip stood in the doorway with his coffee and said it the way he said things he had already decided. "You need to rest, Miriam, not work." She looked up from the data. "The team can manage things," he continued. "I've asked Dr. Renner to absorb your research group into her division temporarily, just until you're fully back on your feet." She took off her reading glasses. She looked at him for a moment with the specific steadiness of a woman who has already understood what is happening and is simply verifying it. "Temporarily," she said. "Of course." He said it easily. The ease of a man who had not considered there was any other possible shape to this conversation. She said nothing further. She did not object. She did not explain that the data she was reviewing contained a dosing model flaw that would cost the Phase 3 trial 6 months if it wasn't corrected before the next round of analysis. She did not tell him that the compound the team would now be managing without her was still licensed to the company under her name, under a document that would expire in less than a year. She set her glasses on the bench beside the data printouts. She looked at the room once, the way a person looks at something they are memorizing. 4 members of her research team came the following Tuesday to collect the portable equipment. She had known all of them for years. Dr. James Oduya, her senior research associate, paused in the doorway with a box of centrifuge attachments and said quietly, "We'll take good care of it, Dr. Solis." He had used her name, her real name. She thanked him. She watched them carry everything down the hall from the room where the best winter light came through the north-facing window, and she understood that temporary was a word people use when they cannot bring themselves to say permanent. The financial restructuring came 3 weeks later. Philip presented it at the kitchen table on a weeknight, a 1-page summary he had printed from the joint account management portal, explaining that he was consolidating their accounts under a single management structure. Simpler, he said, more efficient, easier during recovery. He used the word recovery 4 times in 6 sentences, the implication being that recovery was a state of diminishment that required his management. Miriam read the summary. She asked 2 factual questions about the account structure. She signed where he indicated. She did not mention that her Solis family trust accounts, the ones that received the Ashford Stern dividend payments and royalty flows, the ones her father had established as entirely separate from any marital property, had never been part of any joint account structure, and were therefore completely unaffected by everything Philip had just handed her to sign. He did not know about those accounts. He had never asked. Then came the social dimension, which arrived second-hand, the way social damage always does. Miriam learned it from her friend, Dr. Yolanda Park, a materials scientist she had known since her postdoctoral fellowship, who called one evening in February and said, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering information she thought Miriam needed to have, "I want you to know what I'm hearing because I think you should. People are saying you've been struggling, emotionally, that Philip's been holding everything together." She paused. "I know that's not the whole picture." Miriam thanked her. She asked Yolanda how her daughter was doing. They talked for another 20 minutes about something else entirely. After she hung up, she sat in the kitchen for a long time in the quiet of the house, her hands folded on the table, and she thought about Catherine Ashford and the grammar of concern and the specific efficiency with which a narrative, once released into a social network, becomes its own kind of document. The all-hands meeting happened on a Thursday in March, 300 employees gathered in the main auditorium of the West Wacker building while Miriam was at home. She had not been told about the meeting. She learned about it at 2:17 in the afternoon when her phone lit up with a message from Marcus Webb, a former lab colleague who had remained at the company, who sent a photograph without caption or comment, the kind of message a person sends when they are not sure what to say but believe you should see. The photograph showed Philip at the podium. Natalie Renner stood to his left, carrying herself with the forward-facing confidence of someone who understood that every camera in the room was pointed in her direction and had decided to be comfortable with that. Philip's hand was at the small of her back. It was a brief contact, a half-second of placement that could, if examined in isolation, be described as collegial. It was not collegial. Miriam had been married to this man for 12 years. She knew the difference between the way he touched someone professionally and the way he touched someone he had already decided belonged near him. She set the phone face down on the kitchen table. She sat with what she now knew for a moment, letting it settle into the place where suspicion had been living for months, where it fit with a precision that told her it had always been the correct shape. Then she got up. She walked to her father's study. She took the green accordion folder from the second shelf, the one organized in Ernesto's careful handwriting, color-coded by document type, and she found the section tabbed in blue. Ashford Stern Pharmaceuticals, Founding Documents, Shareholder Agreement, Delaware Filing, March 2011. She opened to page 14. She read section 9-100, with the unhurried attention of a woman who had been trained since childhood to read every sentence in a contract as though it would matter someday. Majority shareholder consent required for executive appointments at the VP level and above. She read it once more. Then she closed the folder. She did not react visibly. She placed both hands flat on the desk for a moment. Her father's desk, cedar and coffee, the wall of case files behind her. And she was very still. She slid the folder back into its place on the shelf, precisely where her father had left it. She turned off the lamp. She went upstairs. She did not sleep for a long time, but she lay in the dark with a quality of stillness that was different from all the stillness that had come before it. This was not the stillness of endurance. It was the stillness of a woman who has just understood that she has everything she needs and is deciding when to use it. The scan results would come the following morning. And with them, finally, the one thing 2 years of illness had taken from her. Time. She did not go home first. That detail matters. On the morning after the scan results came back clean, after Dr. Priya Nair had placed her hand briefly on Miriam's arm in the consultation room on the 3rd floor of the Northwestern Medicine Building on East Erie Street, and said the word clear with the particular care of a clinician who understands what that word costs to wait for. Miriam had walked to her car in the parking structure, sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, and then driven not north toward the house she shared with Philip, but west, toward the house on Farwell Avenue where she had grown up, and where her father's study still waited, unchanged, the way rooms wait for people who need them. She had a key on her ring that she had never removed. She let herself in before 7 in the morning, before the neighborhood's particular autumn quiet had broken into traffic. The house smelled the way it had always smelled. Cedar, coffee, the faint paper and binding smell of 1,000 case files organized by a man who believed that every document deserved to be findable. She did not turn on the overhead light. The early light came through the study window in a long, pale bar across the desk, and that was enough. She sat in her father's chair. It was a leather chair that had been resoled twice and reupholstered once, in the same dark green as the original, because Ernesto Solis had not been a man who discarded things that still worked. Miriam settled into it the way she had settled into it as a child, pulling her feet up, tucking them beneath her, letting the chair's particular firmness organize her spine in a way that felt like being held rather than supported. The fatigue from 2 years of treatment still lived in her body on mornings like this one, a low, persistent weight that the good news had not yet fully lifted. But her mind was clear. It had been clear, she realized, for some time. She reached for the blue cup on the desk. It was where it always was, to the right of the desk lamp, precisely placed, as though her father had set it down that morning rather than 3 years ago. The Northwestern law seal on its side had worn to almost nothing. A pale ghost of letters in a pale ghost of a circle, the kind of mark that persists not because it is maintained, but because it is held carefully by someone who knows its worth. The chip on the handle fit her thumb, as though it had been made for it. Perhaps, she thought, it had. She held the cup in both hands and looked at the wall of case files, at the green accordion folder on the second shelf, at the desk that still smelled faintly of cedar, and the coffee he had made every morning at 6 and carried to this room and drunk while reading, always reading. She thought about her father. Not with grief. The grief had done its work over 3 years, and left something quieter in its place. She thought about him with the specific gratitude of a person who has finally understood a gift completely, and wants to say thank you to someone who is no longer there to hear it. Your name on your work is worth more than any name you borrow, Mija. Never dissolve one into the other. She had heard it as a caution, that first time. A father's protective instinct delivered in the grammar of a legal principle. She had honored it the way she honored most of what he said, completely, practically, without needing to understand its full weight in the moment of receiving it. She had not dissolved her name. She had kept it on the patent, and on the trust, and on every document that mattered, and she had watched the man she loved build his identity on the structure those documents supported. And she had said nothing, first out of love, and then out of grief, and then out of something that had taken her until this morning to name precisely. It was not patience. It was readiness that had not yet found its moment. The moment was here. She set the cup down. She stood from the chair without hurry, and took the green accordion folder from the second shelf, the one in Ernesto's careful handwriting, color-coded in blue for Ashford Stern. She opened to the Delaware Trust Instrument, then to the patent license, then to page 14 of the Founding Shareholder Agreement, section 9 to 100, which she read once with the same complete attention she had given it the night she first read it in this same room, after the photograph Marcus Webb had sent her from the all-hands meeting. Nothing in it had changed. It had never needed to change. Her father had written it to hold. She replaced the documents in their order. She closed the folder. She returned it to the shelf, precisely where he had left it. Then she took her phone from her pocket and called Clara Tan. It was 8:47 in the morning. Clara answered on the second ring, which was how Clara answered everything, not immediately, which would suggest she had been waiting, and not after 3 rings, which would suggest she had hesitated. The Verisol 7 patent license comes up in 60 days, Miriam said. Her voice was level. It did not waver, and she did not qualify it, and there was no sentence that began with, I think, or I could be wrong, but I won't be renewing on the current terms, and I'd like you to request an emergency review of the Solis Family Trust's shareholder rights given the unauthorized VP appointment made last March. Clara was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I'll file the shareholder notice by end of week. A pause. Miriam, are you sure? My scan came back clean this morning. The silence on the other end was not hesitation. It was Clara Tan recalibrating, absorbing one piece of information, cross-referencing it against everything she already knew, arriving at a conclusion with the speed of a woman who had spent 30 years preparing for a call she had always known was coming. "Then let's begin," she said. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it ended, Miriam set her phone on the desk beside the blue cup. She looked at the wall of case files, at the pale morning light across the cedar surface, at the ghost of her father's seal on the ceramic. She thought about the 60-day clock that had just begun running, not for the first time, but for the first time with intention behind it. She picked up a pen from the desk cup. Her father's pen, a black pilot with a fine point that he had favored for annotations. She pulled a legal pad from the desk drawer. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote 2 lines beneath it, the license renewal date and the Section 9/100 citation, and underlined both. Then she set the blue cup in its place, the chip on the handle facing outward, the way her father had always kept it. 58 days later, she walked through a side entrance of the Marriott Marquis on South Michigan Avenue at 9:12 in the morning with Clara Tan beside her and 2 folders in Clara's hands, and the document her father had written in 2011 was finally about to speak in the room it had always been intended for. The Ashford Stern Investor Day had been planned for 8 months. The Marriott Marquis on South Michigan Avenue had been booked in February. The auditorium held 400, and the registration list showed 340 confirmed attendees: institutional investors, board members, select press, and the senior leadership team whose names appeared on the agenda in the order Philip had approved. The seating chart had been designed by his EA, a precise young man named Daniel Firth, who had been meticulous about every detail, including the placement of Natalie Renner's chair in the front row, slightly to the right of center, where the camera angle from the live stream platform would catch her clearly. Miriam's name was not on the seating chart. She had not expected it to be. She arrived through the side entrance on the building's east corridor at 9:12 in the morning, 7 minutes before the Q&A session was scheduled to open. She wore a charcoal blazer over a dark blouse. Practical, composed, the kind of clothing that does not announce itself. On her lapel, small and silver and nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, was her father's Northwestern Law pin. She had worn it every day since she took it from his desk the morning she called Clara. Clara walked beside her, carrying 2 manila folders, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had done difficult things in difficult rooms and understood that speed was not the same as control. A young woman at the side door, an event coordinator whose lanyard read Stephanie Morse, Venue Staff, looked up as they approached. Clara presented a single card. The coordinator read it, looked at her screen, found the registered letter notation that Daniel Firth had forwarded 3 days prior and not flagged, and stepped aside. She did not know what she was letting through. No one had told her. They took 2 seats along the side wall, near the 4th row from the back, where they could see the full room, and the room could, if it chose to turn, see them. Philip was at the podium in a suit that fit him with the careful precision of something bought specifically for this occasion. He was mid-presentation, moving through the company's pipeline projections with the fluid confidence of a man who had given this performance many times and believed in it completely. Natalie sat in the front row with her shoulders back and her attention forward, the posture of someone who had been placed there deliberately and understood her role in the composition. The morning session concluded. The moderator, a biopharma journalist named Richard Calloway, opened the floor for questions. The first 2 questions were routine. Timeline for Phase 3 completion, manufacturing partnership status. Philip answered both without hesitation, from a position of practiced authority. The room was attentive. The live stream cameras were on. Somewhere in the auditorium, 3 senior partners from Hartwell Capital, the Boston-based institutional investor holding $200 million of Ashford Stern equity, sat with the particular stillness of people who have done their reading and are waiting to confirm what they already know. The fund manager was a man named Gerald Osei, 50s, gray at the temples, the flat, careful register of someone paid to be correct rather than impressive. He raised his hand. Richard Calloway nodded to him. "Dr. Ashford," Gerald Osei said, in a voice calibrated precisely to carry without performing, "can you speak to the status of the Verisol 7 licensing agreement and the shareholder notice filed this week by the Solis Family Trust?" The room shifted. It was not a dramatic shift, not a gasp, not a murmur. It was the specific atmospheric change of 340 people redirecting their attention at once, the way a room's temperature changes when a window opens. Philip's expression did not collapse immediately. It went very still, which was a different and more revealing thing. He was a man whose confidence had always been performative, not false, but constructed, worn deliberately. When the performance stalled, what remained underneath was recalculation. He turned. Perhaps he was looking for his general counsel, a man named Stuart Graves who was seated along the right wall. Perhaps he was looking for his EA. Perhaps he was simply turning on instinct, the way people turn when something behind them has changed. What he found, in 2 chairs along the left side wall that had not appeared on any seating chart, was his wife. She was seated. Her hands were in her lap. The charcoal blazer was neat. Her reading glasses were in her breast pocket. She had not needed them yet. She looked at him without expression, with the complete and unhurried composure of a woman who had been patient for a very long time and was no longer required to be. Clara Tan stood. Her voice carried cleanly in the auditorium's acoustics, not loud, not performed, simply placed with precision in the available silence. "I represent Dr. Miriam Solis Ashford," she said, "trustee and sole beneficiary of the Solis Family Medical Trust, which holds a 54% controlling equity stake in Ashford Stern Pharmaceuticals, and personal patent holder of Verisol 7 under United States Patent Number 9847-223, currently licensed, not assigned, to this company." She opened the first folder. She placed the patent certificate on the table in front of her, facing the room. The document had Miriam's name on it, her legal name, Dr. Miriam Solis, not Ashford. Solis. "The license expires in 58 days, Clara said. "Dr. Solis will not be renewing under current terms." The room did not make a sound. Consider what that silence contained. The man at the podium who had told his wife, in front of 4 colleagues, that she hadn't been in the lab in 8 months, standing in a room now looking at a patent certificate bearing her name on the mechanism those colleagues had been refining without her. The woman in the front row whose 8-month research pipeline was built entirely on that mechanism, now understanding in real time the precise legal weight of what she had never thought to ask about. 340 people reconfiguring everything they thought they knew about who had built what and at whose expense. Clara opened the second folder. This one was thicker. Additionally, the Solis Family Trust is exercising its majority shareholder right to review the appointment of Natalie Renner as Executive Vice President of Research and Development, made without majority shareholder notification or consent, in violation of Section 9-100 of the Founding Shareholder Agreement dated March 14, 2011. She set the document on the table with the same even placement. That appointment is hereby suspended pending review. Natalie Renner had been very still from the moment Gerald Osei asked his question. She did not look at Philip now. She looked at the folder. She was a woman of considerable intelligence, and she had that intelligence directed, in this moment, at a single calculation. What this meant for her specifically, and what her options were. Her face did not crumble, it sharpened, and then, gradually, it smoothed into the careful neutrality of someone choosing not to react publicly to information they are still processing. Philip opened his mouth. No sentence came. He was a man who had built his identity on the ability to speak fluently in rooms of power, and the room had changed in a way his fluency had not prepared for. He was looking at Miriam. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the room, at the 340 people whose understanding of the last 12 years had just been permanently revised, at the live stream cameras carrying that revision outward to several thousand more, at the space between what everyone in this auditorium had believed this morning and what they knew now. She did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She did not address Philip or Natalie or the moderator. She simply looked at the room with the steady, unhurried calm of a woman who had survived things harder than this, and said, quietly enough that the nearest microphone had to work to catch it, "I developed this compound before I knew his name." The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before. The first silence had been shock. This one was comprehension. The understanding, arriving in 340 people simultaneously, that what they had witnessed was not a disruption of the company's story, but the correction of it. Clara placed a third document on the table, the proposed new licensing terms, 47 pages, prepared over 11 weeks with the careful thoroughness of her father's former junior partner, who had spent 30 years waiting to execute exactly this. She slid it toward Philip's side of the table. Miriam gathered her jacket from the back of her chair. She stood. She and Clara walked to the side door they had entered through, past the live stream cameras, past the rows of investors who did not speak, past Daniel Firth's immaculate seating chart, with its careful blank where her name had not been placed. The door closed behind them without sound. At the podium, Philip Ashford looked at the document in front of him. Then he looked at the chair along the side wall. The chair that had not been on his seating chart. The chair that was now empty. He had built something real. He had always built something real. He simply had not, in 12 years, asked whose name was on the foundation beneath it. Now he knew. The room knew. The cameras were still running. What followed was not dramatic in the way people imagine these things to be. There was no public confrontation, no shouting in corridors, no scene that would make good television. What followed was documents and filings and registered letters and formal processes moving with the slow, irresistible momentum of things that have been correctly prepared. This is how her father had always worked. It was how she worked too. Natalie Renner's VP appointment was suspended within 48 hours of the investor day, pending the shareholder review Clara had initiated. 4 days later, on a Monday morning, Natalie submitted her resignation before the review concluded. It was, as Clara noted when she called to inform Miriam, a legally calibrated decision, the kind that suggested Natalie had spent the weekend with her own attorney and arrived at the same conclusion that attorney had. She left quickly and completely, the way people leave when they have understood that the ground they were standing on was never registered in their name. The research pipeline she had built in 8 months, 5 projects assembled from Miriam's transferred team, and the Verisol 7 mechanism's foundational architecture, was frozen pending IP clarification. 3 of the 5 had no viable path forward without a renewed license. The other 2 were renegotiable, Clara said, at terms that reflected the actual ownership of the underlying science. Natalie's name did not appear in any of the renegotiation documents. There was nothing left for it to appear in. Philip called 7 times in the 4 days following Investor Day. Miriam did not answer the first 6. On the 7th, a Wednesday evening when the light was going flat over the Farwell Avenue garden and she was reading in her father's chair, she picked up. She listened for 90 seconds to the apology that was also a negotiation, to the love that had arrived only now that withholding it cost him something real, to the sentence that began, "I think we can work through," before she said gently, with the specific gentleness of a woman who has nothing left to prove to anyone in this conversation. "Philip, you signed a document in 2011 that you didn't read. Everything that happened after that was a consequence of that choice. Not mine." She hung up. She did not call back. She returned to her book. She read the same paragraph twice, not because she hadn't understood it, but because she wanted to. Catherine's call came from a number Miriam didn't recognize, which was how she answered it by mistake. Catherine began with concern. "Miriam, I hope you're keeping your strength up through all of this. It must be so difficult." And pivoted within 40 seconds to what she actually wanted, which was clarity on whether Philip's personal 31% equity stake was protected in the renegotiation. Miriam said, "His 31% is his. It always was." Then she said, "I hope you're keeping your strength up too, Catherine," with a warmth that was entirely genuine and entirely complete, the warmth of a woman who no longer needs anything from this conversation, and therefore has nothing to withhold from it. Catherine could not locate the edge of it. She ended the call soon after. She did not call again. The license was renegotiated over 11 weeks. The new terms were specific and binding. Dr. Miriam Solis restored formally as Chief Scientific Officer, her original founding title, which had been absorbed into Philip's organizational charts 3 years earlier without documentation that would hold scrutiny. A royalty restructuring valued at $180 million over 5 years, and a board seat registered in her name. Philip retained his CEO title. He was genuinely good at the operational work. He had always been good at it. The difference now was that every person in the building, every investor in the registry, every journalist who covered the story in Biopharma Weekly, and the Chicago Business Journal understood what had always been true and had simply never been made visible, that the company had been built around a scientist whose name was on every document that mattered, and that the man who ran it had been, for 12 years, the tenant of a house he had never owned. The scene softened into something quieter after that. Miriam did not move into a new house. She moved into her father's house on Farwell Avenue, the one she had kept through the marriage and the treatment and the long, patient years of waiting. She had it repainted in the colors she had always preferred. A warm terracotta in the study, a pale sage in the kitchen, the deep blue she had loved since childhood in the room that would become her laboratory. Not the neutrals Philip had preferred. Her colors. She hired a painter named Tony Reyes, who worked carefully and asked few questions and said, when he was finished, that the house looked like it had always been meant to look this way. She thought he was right. She reinstalled her laboratory in the downstairs room that got the best natural light, the north-facing room with the long windows that faced the garden and the old oak at the back of the property. She called Dr. James Oduya first, then the rest of the research team, in the order they had come to say goodbye when the equipment was carried out. They came back the same way, carefully, with their equipment and their notebooks and the specific focused energy of scientists returning to work they had never stopped thinking about. The room filled up again. It smelled like a laboratory again. It smelled like hers. On the first morning she worked in the restored lab, she made coffee in her father's blue cup, the chip on the handle worn smooth from years of her thumb finding the same spot. The Northwestern law seal faded now to almost nothing, just the pale ghost of letters that refused to disappear entirely. She stood at the north window with the cup in both hands and looked at the garden in the early light, at the oak, at the frost still on the grass in the shadows. The fatigue from treatment had mostly gone by now, replaced by the particular energy of a woman who has returned to the work her mind was built for, working in a room that belongs to her, in a house where every wall is painted the color she chose. She thought about what her father had said at the kitchen table, and this time, the third time, the final time, It did not arrive as advice or as instruction. It arrived as simple truth, the way things arrive when they have finally been fully understood. Your name on your work is worth more than any name you borrow, Misha. Never dissolve one into the other. Her name was on the patent. Her name was on the trust. Her name was on the board, the license, the founding documents filed in Delaware in 2011. Her name was on the door of the laboratory, newly lettered in the frosted glass panel, in the clean serif typeface she had chosen herself. Dr. Miriam Solis, Chief Scientific Officer. She had not dissolved. She had simply been the only one who knew where to look. Until, finally, everyone did. This is what this story is really about. Not the company, not the documents, not the dollars and percentages and legal instruments, though all of those matter, and all of them were real. It is about the difference between the name on a door and the name on a document. A title can be given and taken, revised and omitted, absorbed quietly into someone else's organizational chart. A patent endures. A trust instrument endures. The name on the work endures, because it was placed there by a careful man who understood that the most durable protection is the one no one thinks to challenge until it is already too late to change. Miriam Solis had carried that protection for 12 years, not as a weapon, not as insurance, but as the quiet inheritance of a father who loved her precisely and well. She had not needed to become someone else to use it. She had only needed to become, finally and fully, herself. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been in a room where your name was missing from the story of your own life, leave a comment below and tell me. And drop a note to let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. She set the cup down in its place on the windowsill, the chip facing outward, the way her father had always kept it. She picked up her pen. She pulled the legal pad toward her and wrote the date at the top, the way she had been taught. Then she began.